very much. Well, it's a real privilege to be here and an honor in this amazing facility of the museum we've got. Before I get going, there's a few people in the audience that I need to thank, and first thanks Doug for introducing me, but also mostly to Keith Ogilvie. Of course, I don't need to introduce Keith to this group, but after I read his book that he had written based on his father's journals on being a Spitfire pilot in the war, I reached out to Keith and learned that he lived here in Saanich, Victoria. My good friend Lenny, who's back there helping me out, he's been in Victoria for the last 50 years, but we've known each other since kindergarten, which seems like a long time ago now. Steve Nichols, of course, I went for it. I did not get to meet, but he helped arrange all this. And I'd also like to point out Darren Stagg, who's here. He helped edit the book. He was contracted through a publisher here in Victoria. Darren edited the book, and he helped make it into something that was very presentable. And if anybody has plans to write a story or a book, please contact Darren. He was an amazing job. So thanks again. In the book, I'll refer to my father, sometimes my father, sometimes by his initials, L-E-W. Mostly I'll call him just Dad, although it sounds odd because I'm now older than he ever got to be, but he'll always be my dad. This is not a book reading per se, but I will have quotes from the book quotes from his journal portion to describe, put into feeling what he was thinking at the time and things like that. There's lots of pictures of airplanes because I know what this group is interested in, but it's not you guys folks know more about airplanes than I do. So this is a story, my father's story. There's some travel in it, there's some interesting, I hope, anecdotes, and we'll see where it takes us over the next 40 minutes or so. So that's the cover of the book. We had some technical difficulties earlier in the evening, but thanks to Steve and Doug for getting them sorted out, and my wife back home in Ontario. These are on the left is the pictures actually of the journals. Unlike a lot of people, we did not know they existed until my father passed away. I was about 25 at the time, so it's a while ago. I immediately hung on to those journals. I didn't let my brother or sister, not that I didn't trust them, but I didn't. And it took a while, though their handwriting was very, very good. They were starting to fade, and I got them typed up, and then I sat on them for a few decades. And then I realized I wasn't getting any younger, so I better start working on these. And I did them originally for my children and grandchildren to see what their grandfather had done, because it started out, my dad ended up being ill and in a wheelchair, and I pleaded with him to get into a wheelchair and just let somebody take care of him. He said, "Chris, when you've seen what I've seen and done what I've done, I just can't sit in a wheelchair." And that's how it kind of got started. The picture on the right is him in a naval uniform. He started out the war. He was from England in the British Merchant Navy. And I'll talk a little bit. This is the only picture we have from the British in a naval uniform. The talk sprinkled with pictures that he took in North Africa, as well as stuff that I unashamedly downloaded from that great resource, the internet, and we'll be able to tell the difference. So how we got into the Merchant Navy, I don't know, but I think, so I'm going to give first few slides on the Merchant Navy and his transition into the Royal Air Force. He was in the Merchant Navy for not all that long, about just under 2 years, and I think when I show a couple slides you'll understand his desire to get out. These are, and how we got into the Merchant Navy and volunteered. My mother, ruefully, I remember her saying, "Of course your father had to volunteer to be in the Navy, Merchant Navy, before the war even started." And this is a picture of his parents, who I never met. And Arthur Edward, and again, I'm being able to get a little bit of research. He was one of this picture was taken of my dad's parents, probably 1915, 1916. So Arthur was one of the first volunteers in Lord Kitchener when they realized the First World War wasn't going to be over real fast, Lord Kitchener put out a call for volunteers. They said they would need another 1 million men. And Arthur was one of those volunteers. He was served in France from 1915, May of 1915, right until the war was over. He was an ambulance driver, and I discovered he was in the 9th Division. And when I looked at some troop maps of locations, they fought right beside the Canadian Army in April of 1917 when the Canadians took Vimy Ridge, which of course is a defining moment in our country's history. Lillian is in the uniform of the Women's Legion, which was, for the ladies in the audience, was a volunteer organization. There was 40,000 women. Based on her uniform, she's in the motor transport of the Army Service Corps. And my mother always said that my grandmother was an ambulance driver. I don't think it was quite accurate, and my mother had never met her. But it was likely she was a volunteer driver and probably picking up wounded troops coming back from France, delivering them to different medical facilities in London. So to be a woman driver in 1915 was something for sure, because of course she was not allowed to vote back then. But it was the efforts of women like her that did get women to vote shortly after the Second World War. So I think, so they both volunteered, so that provided perhaps some incentive for my father to volunteer. And also on my grandmother's birth certificate and marriage certificate, her father's occupation was as master mariner and barge master down near London. So perhaps my dad had heard stories of the sea from her, and that resonated with him. My father started out on an oil tanker. He was an engineer on an oil tanker, the MV motor vehicle Corvus. It was owned by the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, which is now part of Shell, and that doesn't really matter. But they were not large ships in the Second World War. A top speed of 11 knots or 13 miles an hour, which is not very fast when you have 3,000 miles of ocean to cover. Cargoes that carried crude oil, gasoline, naphtha in barrels. You don't need much of an imagination to know what would happen to that cargo if it stayed out of torpedo. So Dad was one of several engineers. They worked non-stop around the clock to keep these ships moving. Prior to 1940, of course, this kind of sum up a lot of history in one slide. They would go to Romania or Haifa in Palestine to get oil, and then take it to France to deliver it to the British Expeditionary Force before they were evacuated at Dunkirk. So that was in the spring, of course, May, June of 1940. Italy joined the war in June of 1940, and that essentially cut the Mediterranean off from the Allied shipping. So then began the Battle of the Atlantic, and so a typical cruise, they then had to go to South America for oil. So their typical cruise, this is started this one here, actually started in France. They would come down solo or independently, the ships by themselves, down to Venezuela or Uruguay to pick up oil. They'd then go back up and convoy up at Bermuda, then up the eastern seaboard of the United States to Halifax, and then do the convoys across the Atlantic. And I'm sure most of you here have heard of the Battle of the Atlantic and the convoys and the role of the Canadian Navy in providing escorts to the convoys. My father was in early 1939, 1940. There was very few escorts available at the start of the war. In fact, the Canadian Navy, I think, had 13 ships when the war broke out. 2 of those, I understand, were sailing ships. So Canada was not in a good position, with all due respect. But the Germans were ready to go the day the war opened. Their U-boats were out in the ocean, and their surface raiders were out there ready. So this was typical convoy, or I don't know what's typical. December 1940, convoy HX-90. So HX stands for Halifax, outboard from Halifax to the United Kingdom. And the tankers and that, they were put into what they call fast convoys. They were expected to be able to maintain 9 knots U-boats could do 17 to 20 knots, so they were no match for the U-boats anyways. This particular convoy had one escort when it left Halifax, which for some inexplicable reason left the convoy. It was off the coast of Greenland before they got to Ireland to pick up the convoy going back to Canada. And there was 8 U-boats waiting for the convoy, and they sank 11 of the 40 ships in over about a 24-hour period. That was my dad's third Atlantic crossing. That convoy, or the convoy HX-90, is mentioned in many books on the Battle of the Atlantic, and there's one author, Spencer Edwards, said that it was essentially that it was a massacre that night. And my dad did not talk about war very much, but he often made comments, and one of them, I'm perhaps paraphrasing here, but one of the things I certainly remember is that one of the most horrific sights you can imagine is seeing a ship on fire, the sailors leaping into the ocean, and your ship is not allowed to stop and pick anyone up. The escorts sometimes stopped to pick sailors up, but again they became targets, and their primary role was to protect the other merchant ships. Sometimes the convoys had a tugboat or something as a rescue ship, but not all the time. So that was his last convoy. That was December 1940. He was one of the last people allowed to get out of the Merchant Navy. And you can see, fortunate for me, he did. His ship was sunk later in the war. We'll see that actually in another slide. So immediately he joined January 1941. He joined the Royal Air Force, and as these bullet points backwards, he went into training. He was a mechanic in the Navy, so it was not surprising he became a mechanic in the Air Force, and there was his service records that held it as a fitter, 2E. He was qualified to work on Hercules and Pegasus engines, and I think those were in the Wellington bombers, Halifax, maybe the Lancasters. I'm a bit nervous to say things like that with this crowd. So he was assigned at first to the 57th Squadron Bomber Command. And of course the picture here, this picture below shows a ground crew working on the engines of a Wellington in a nice warm, neat hangar. And of course that was not always the case. This picture, I like this, servicing a bomber engines out in the field while the harvest is being taken in. And as Keith's father's journals in the book happily say, they rarely had hangars close to the front lines. So the ground crews were repairing, working on the airplanes outside in all sorts of conditions. This is another interesting picture, and it comes from a website, probably you fellows and ladies know it, but it's called Tail End Charlie Ted Church. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It's a great website. He was a tail end gunner in Lancaster, I believe. But he also had some large sections describing ground crews and other parts of the squadrons that kept the organization going. I think this shows the flight crew here, or parts of it. There's 10 people here, which is a bit more than the ground crew. And I think there's 27 or 30 other people back there. It took a lot of people to keep a bomber going. There's armorers, there's electronics, there's body people. There's a fuel truck there, which again is very important. We'll come back to that. So it took a lot of people to keep an airplane up in the air, and that's not to take anything away from the courage of the flight crew. But sometimes the ground crew gets overlooked, and it's certainly very important. In 1942, Dad was assigned to a 26 operational training unit, which had just been formed in January 42 to train night bomber crews. And that's when the Royal Air Force switched from doing daytime bombing raids to nighttime bombing raids. So The British and Canadians participated mostly in nighttime bombing raids, whereas the Americans kept up the daytime bombing raids. And they also began using the Afro-Lancaster at about that time. And Dad was appointed sergeant. 1941 to 43, he remained in Britain as part of the training unit. And he had some interesting information. The typical bombing raid consisted of 400 to 700 airplanes and Lancasters, which is a lot. May of 1942, they put the first 1,000 bomber raid together, and a lot of them were 1,000 planes after that time. Each Lancaster carried 2,100 gallons of fuel and 600 gallons of lubricating fluid. So multiply that by 1,000 planes, and you can see how important oil was to the war effort. And I'm not even sure one tanker back in those days would be sufficient for 1,000 plane raid, because the tankers were not large. Which also points out why tankers were a primary target of the U-boats, because they knew that the Allied war efforts relied on oil as well. This might seem a little bit of a divergence, but I traveled to England on a few times to do background research on this for this book. So what I did, I took my father's diaries, and then as I started reading them, I was wondering what else was going on in the war at the time. So I started to insert material of bullet points, because I thought the average reader's not going to know. I wanted to put that in perspective. And I did other things. I put in some of Churchill's speeches. When Dad was in the Merchant Navy, he would say, listen to this, Winston's speech today. And so I would look up what speech did Churchill give that day, and I put excerpts in the books. I thought the speeches were just wonderful. I mean, even today, they're just he's quite an orator, obviously. So one of the trips I took, I booked a passage on a container ship, which is a merchant sea, and went from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Liverpool, which essentially followed the same route that the convoys took 80 years earlier. And it was quite, I guess, a bit of a pilgrimage for me. It was exciting. I enjoyed it. I loved being in the water. It was a bit anticlimactic. We had good weather. We were traveling at 20 knots, so we were there under half the time that the convoys took. And of course, there's no U-boats chasing us down. You can book passage on a private or a container ship or a merchant ship, and they'll take up to 12 passengers. And I think there's 8 of us on this trip. And one of them was a very well-traveled German lady. And we had some, I was very open why I was taking the trip, and it was interesting. She was maybe a bit older than me, and her father had been in the German army on the Russian front. So we had some great stories. She made it very clear that he was a German, but not a Nazi. And there was a big difference. And she said near the end of the war, he and a bunch of people, they deserted and hid out until the war was over. And he said they had had enough. So we had some good interesting talks. And one of the first places I went to was Royal, the location of the RAF base Kirby. It was a training base during the Second World War, and also an assembly point for soldiers being sent overseas. So my father was there, and he talks about it in his journals before going overseas on a troop ship. And we'll talk a bit about the troop ship journey for sure. So I went there. It's all the base being decommissioned, put back to agricultural land. And the taxi driver that took me there, and it's several miles outside of Liverpool, the taxi driver that took me there said, I've been past this monument dozens of times. He said, I never knew what it was for. So it got me thinking. So now whenever I see a plaque or a monument, I try to slow down and see what it's for, because there's usually a good story behind it. This may seem a little bit boring, but I know guys like Keith or anybody working in the archives or the library here will appreciate. So I went to, it's called Kew, K-E-W, it's just outside of London. You get there by 2. And they have all the records, the operational records from the war, the Navy and the Air Force and things like that. So you're able to look online to select what documents you want to review in advance. They don't have everything electronic, but you can request the documents when you travel there. They'll provide them to you, and of course it's very organized, as you would expect the English to be, very orderly. And sometimes you get a book or a document in 5 minutes, you know it's not what you want, and other times you spend hours pouring through these things. So, and a lot of them were stamped confidential, so that was kind of exciting to me. This is for this one on the right. It says West Africa and Shaiba, and Dad was stationed in started off in Shaiba, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. This is literally what the records books looks like. The entries are very somewhat detailed, but on the other hand, they're not. They're very matter of fact. This talks about, you can't read it, and that's 16 sorties of 75 squadron, and et cetera. This one, all aircraft returned safely to base from operation. What's the weather? Down here, one aircraft of 57 squadron crashed near Southerly. All the crew, with exception of Sergeant Martin, were killed. And it goes on and on and on, and they're very sobering entries to read. And it made me think afterwards, and like the entry that Keith edited, another wonderful book that's called Failed to Return. And that would be a typical entry for a bomber that did not return from a mission, just failed to return, and it would list the crew members often. So if anybody has not read that book or seen it, I heartily recommend you to get it. I'm sure it's here in your library. It's, on one hand, it's heartbreaking, but it's also a wonderful memorial to and it's all based on Canadian airmen that failed to return. So it's a wonderful tribute to those young men. 1943, and there's some dates that I thought were starting to coincide here. On April 15th, he boarded a troop shift in Liverpool to go to the Middle East and ended up in North Africa. April 17th, 2 days later, was his birthday. He would have been 32, but he doesn't even mention that in his journal. He talks about all sorts of things other than that. And then the very next day, the ship he'd been on was sunk by a U-boat in the Indian Ocean. 50 crew were killed and 10 survivors in an open boat for 2 weeks. I don't know whether he ever knew that his ship had been sunk, whether, that's some information I didn't know until we got some insight. And one of the best source of information is something called uboat.net. It's a website, and it's very detailed, started by the Germans, and very, very detailed on information. We're going to talk a little bit about the trip, his troop ship, and troop ships, I should say. So he's looking at Liverpool, and he says, "Our ship looks immense as we gaze up at her sides at the rails, which are fairly full, well filled with troops, and we wonder how many torpedoes it will take to sink her. At least I do. I think 2 will probably capsize her, need bother at all." But different way of looking at things, and that's the picture of the first troop ship he was on. And he gets a bit cynical. He says, "We're boarding at Liverpool. We arrive at Liverpool. The point duty policeman holds up traffic. He smiles. He should. We don't. Why should we? A Sprague service police corporal bids us to smoke. We smoke." Does anybody know what a Sprague?
Rookie.
Pardon me?
Rookie.
Rookie, exactly. Inexperienced rookie. Now he's been in by 4 years by now. He thinks he's a bit cocky. And here, once he's on the ship, he said, "I'm fed up to think I'm going to the Irish Sea again, the same route I've been so often before." So he's been in it for a while, and already he's getting a bit cynical. The second journal, he's in the Air Force, and it's very different writing style. Of course, it's full of acronyms, which you don't have when you're in the Merchant Navy. There's no layers of bureaucracy. His journal from his time in the Merchant Navy said, talked about the captain sitting in his cabin or going, you know, and things like that. Well, that would never happen in the Navy, you know, the actual Navy. So it's full of acronyms. Senior non-commissioned officer, medical orderly, headquarters, of course. And then there's a lot of jargon, which Darren forced me to try and sort out many times. He'd say, what's this? And I took a lot of things by granted that I knew. So he forced me to rethink some things. Hence the book ended up with a lot of footnotes, but I think they worked well. Does anybody know what ERC?
Ground crew.
Ground crew, the lowest kind of denominator in the ground crew, and they think it's a Cockney bastardization of the word aircraftsman. How they come up with ERC, I don't know. But yeah, oh, skates. I had to take a guess at this one. Oh, you read the book? No, okay. Skates. It was. He refers, and we'll talk about a few more slides. I think they're prisoners. There are, you know, they're Air Force prisoners, or could be Army prisoners, and they put a bunch of them aboard his troop ship. Why they would do that, I still can't figure that out, but it caused a lot of trouble, as we'll see. Puka.
Good.
Pardon?
Good.
Good, yeah, genuine, yeah, good. Kites, that's what he called the airplanes taking off. Yeah, and all sorts of jargon that, it was interesting. There actually are websites with acronyms and slang terms defined, but some of these I could not find. He was very critical of the ships. You know, pardon the language here a bit, but the ship, has a lousy roll to her. She's an ancient ship, and I might add, a particularly lousy, blasted, traveling cockroach infested abortion, not fit for cattle. and the discrepancy between officers and the average, you know, airman seemed to really bother him. He was from lower class Yorkshire, and he wasn't using this. And he said the officers again occupy about 40% of the ship and represent about 2% of the personnel. I'm disgusted that the British Army should permit such a miscarriage of justice to exist. And he goes on quite a bit about this. He works up to a very large, he spends quite a few pages talking about skates boarding the ship. In fact, one kicking a policeman in the wherever and getting shot. And you know, he said, well, at least he's achieved his purpose. He didn't board the ship. And then for days, the skates were drinking a lot where they got all the booze, and then they came up to they had a huge fight in one of the lounges, I guess, or on one of the floors. And you know, most accountants don't talk about this kind of thing. And you know, he was saying, he made a very detailed description. He said the atmosphere becomes tense when the sailors draw razors and make passage at the officers' throats. And one of the skates gets hold of a glass in the approved Glasgow manner and threatens the officer the moment it was taking the pacifying effort. And of course, there's also a lot of women on board. There are officers and Wrens and things like that. And these fellas are threatening them, of course, and you can imagine. And he says, I sit on, and he said it isn't every day one witnesses close to a full class mutiny, and with a table full of drinks to boot. And then things started to get settled down. A squad of Seaforth Highlanders, there must be something with rifle and bayonets fixed, are now rounding the skates up. And one sailor is persuaded that resistance is futile by a Seaforth tapping him on the head with a rifle butt. I suspect it was quite a tap. So, yeah, you don't hear about those things too often. The passage, they knew that, I think he knew they were going to the Middle East, but they didn't know where. They were told that the voyage would take a few weeks, ended up taking 3 months. 3 months, 3 different ships, 3 ports en route. The route, they started off in Liverpool, of course, and then they stopped we'll go back to the map because you're going to read this text now anyways. There's generally 2,000 to 4,000 troops on a ship, and of course with all their equipment, so that's a lot of gear, a lot of people. And probably not a lot, it's not like a cruise ship where there's probably one staff for every 3 passengers. It would not be that there. And probably, it's hard, there's no fixed figures, but they estimate over 2 million troops were moved around on these trip ships, partially around to the Middle East, and then during Operation Torch, when the Allies reinvaded North Africa, they used a lot of troop ships for that. And despite all the dangers, and again, Dan talks about it in the journal, the troop ship convoys were rarely attacked. They were well defended, and lots of escorts, and they were fast. They were usually faster ships than the U-boats, so they were hard to catch. So there was danger, but they were kind of some books say a non-event. I wouldn't put it that way when you see the conditions of that. Of course, they started in Liverpool. They often first stop in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which I read in one book was described as, by the Merchant Navy, as the most soul and energy destroying port imaginable. Not high praise. Then they stopped in Durban, and Dad makes a lot of really detailed observations on the people and the ports, and was genuinely interested, it seems. He seemed to like Durban and looked into emigrating there after the war, and I guess that would have changed things for me. They then went up to Bombay, which is now Mumbai, changed ships again, and then ultimately went up the Persian Gulf to the mouth of the Euphrates River, to Port Abadan. The final destination there, they then went to RF base Shaiba, which was established as an RF 8 base about 1920, very early. During the Second World War, its primary purpose was to assemble Hurricanes and Spitfires for the Russian Army, or the Russian Air Force. And they would fly them from there over. The Russian pilots would pick them up and go over to India and then up into Russia. I think when Dad arrived, there was about 6,200 personnel. It had been up to over 12,000, so it was not a small base. It was not insignificant. Not great conditions by all sounds of it. His comments that he said, the hunt for bed mates starts about 9:30 p.m. We killed 2 scorpions and 3 spiders. We had a dust storm all day, dust was everywhere, very uncomfortable. 7 of the Yerks went sick this morning. Visibility is too bad for flights, it's often a comment. He recorded mentioning daytime temperatures up to 124 Fahrenheit. And the RF, you can look it up, they actually developed a song called the Shaiba Blues, which is, if you were there, you got to sing the Shaiba Blues. When he first got there was a lease program to Russia. He commented, he said, I saw hundreds of Hurricanes here with the Russia star on it. It amazed me to see them. He talks about how the people back home would be pretty surprised to see that as well. He also made a very comment about Russia. He thought after the war, Russia was going to be a bigger problem than Germany. That was well before the war was over. So it ended up, Britain supplied almost 7,500 aircraft to Russia, and the United States, of course, Lenny and I were just talking about the production capacity. The Americans, they saw almost 15,000 airplanes, and of course hundreds of tanks with thousands of guns, trucks, and the rest of it. Something that we don't often hear about. Again, one of the reasons I wanted to look at some of the operational record book, I guess for my own satisfaction, I had my dad's service records, and it just said April 1943, Iraq. And then the next entry was he'd been in hospital for 10 days in Iraq. And then the next entry was him being demobilized back in London. So it didn't say anything about him being in North Africa or these other locations. So I kind of, for my own edification, I don't know if that's the proper word, I wanted to see if what my dad was describing in his journals matched up what was recorded for these bases, and indeed it did. This was a kind of an interesting entry. So he was probably part of the 119 Operational Maintenance Unit. And considerable delay has been caused, however, by the refusal of the Russians to accept aircraft which have flown more than 40 hours since noon. That was a bit nervy of them to turn down a barely used aircraft. And again, another incident, August 1943, he said we had a Canadian in the mess who'd walked 8 miles from a machine that had force landed in the desert. He used a compass and carried a revolver. He was lucky. And indeed, there were records for that date recorded a Beaufort had been forced to land in the desert the day before. The station commander searched for him in a gypsy moth, and the pilot was found suffering from heat stroke, but he was brought back safely. So I guess that's a Bristol Beaufort.
That's a Beaufort. It was labeled as a Beaufighter.
Bullfighter, yeah.
It's a Beaufort.
Right, that's right. But that's, I didn't type that in, actually. It's, yeah. Obviously, food was very important to the troops, and he had kept a couple of menus from his time in Christmas in the Merchant Navy, and one from Shiba on Christmas. And that's a picture of his dugout, Christmas 1943. I won't belabor this, but there's quite a detailed menu with a list of all the wines on it. And I love the comment, any resemblance between the wines listed below and those available under the same names in the United Kingdom is purely coincidental and truly remarkable. Typical British humor again. He was assigned to RF-based Gambit, which is over near Tobruk, and we'll come back to that. Started off leaving from Shiba overland, and then they picked up a train near Jerusalem. But he passes through some very interesting places, of course. This is a picture from his book. These are his pictures. That's called an RF, we called it a desert bus. And it looks like a part of a bus, something on a truck, being pulled by a truck. This is them making stew in the desert, and this is my father kneeling, and they probably would have brewed up a pot of tea as well. It sounded like an adventurous trip. We said at midnight, we all awoke from our dozing to a violent breaking and saw about 12 very picturesque Arab guards in the road. They had bandoliers and silver chased daggers at their waists, a real business-like crowd. We then had a terrifying ride through the night at the side of mountains over the Jordan down the other side, and we fetched up at the Palestinian border about 4 a.m. And I remember they waited there till the border opened up. They didn't want to bother anybody. They then went from train to Tobruk. Or again, his service records do not record that, but this is one of his pictures of my dad. And I guess one of the other things that got me interested in all this is growing up, he did have a photo album that I would just spend hours looking at all these pictures. And of course, never talked to him about it, which in hindsight, I'd give anything to be able to do now. And of course, Tobruk has been an important deep water port in the Mediterranean since ancient Greek days. And well, you could read this yourselves, but never have I seen such a scene of devastation. The harbor was full of sunken ships of all sizes, including several that had been beached in an attempt to save them. We learned afterwards that they had got 600 Italian women camp followers out of one ship, all dead of course. And Tobruk was very famous, as you know. It was held by the Axis powers. The Allies captured it, and then Rommel was sent in by Hitler to take over in the west, in the desert. He was under siege for almost 9 months. The Australians fought Rommel off very successfully. And then finally, Rommel took it back again. And I remember my dad saying, and it's very well recorded also, since learned, that Dad said, you know, the British troops, we didn't eat all that well, but the Germans, when they took Tobruk, were very happy to eat our bully beef because they were not being, they were starving, the German troops. They were very undernourished. And then, of course, Tobruk was retaken again after the second battle of El Alamein. Just another 10 minutes, not even.
We got lots of time.
Royal Air Force Gambit was very important, quite strategic. They said it was 50 kilometers southeast of Tobruk. It was a very important facility during the war. Large number of RAF squadrons, as well as South African Air Force and the U.S. Air Force. There's one of Dad's pictures, the boys at Gambit, in his handwriting. And I think the Americans were always amused that the British forces would wear shorts in the North Africa, but it made perfect sense. In fact, one of the Irks wrote a book called How I Got My Knees Brown. The records book for 1944 said Gambit is considered one of the most isolated and foul weather stations. It is nevertheless a happy one. Heavy rains cause extensive flooding. Gales so violent that the majority of tenting is written off twice between November and April. This is, again, just from the internet, an actual Bristol Blenheim. Blenheim, yeah. That was at Gambit in 1942. Again, this audience is much more well-versed in types of aircraft, but when I think of aircraft from World War II or British, the Allies, I think Lancasters and Wellingtons, Hurricanes and Spitfires. So I started to assemble a list of the airplanes and aircraft that my dad had mentioned in his journals, and it was quite an impressive list. And of course, Gambit being where it was, there was a wide range of targets accessible from that location. They could do anti-submarine patrols, convoy escorts by then. They opened up the Mediterranean and targeted bombing targets in Greece, Crete, Sicily, and Italy. Of course, Italy was invaded in September of 1943. And the operational record books document many interactions of their flight, their aircraft, with the Luftwaffe, Messerschmitt 109 and Junkers 52. These are pictures from Dad's, again, his photo albums, so it's kind of in the wake of Montgomery's army. Of course, if you think of Montgomery going across the 8th Army across the coastal road and engaging Ronald Reagan, chasing him right across the north of Africa. Just scenes of devastation along there. This would be a Panzer heavy tank and a Panzer light tank. The remnants of air battles, twin engine, again, you folks can take a guess at them, twin engine, maybe Junkers, and it might have been a Messerschmitt single engine fighter. Dad mentions in his journals going to Army radio parts so they could hook up a radio to listen to them in their tents, jerry cans, anything that might be useful to them. Of course, the human toll, and these are his pictures, and my wife helped assemble these, format these last week, and it was Remembrance Day, so she added lest we forget. We certainly should not. Hitler had instructed his forces to fight to the last man. Fortunately, they did not. When they surrendered, the Allies took over 270,000 prisoners, of German and Italian prisoners, the largest capitulation of the war. There were perils at Gambit, of course. They weren't front line, but their fighters and planes were leaving and going to the front line. He records, we lost 4 of the South African Marauders out of 6 that went out one night. It's amazing to see the kites go from here, often as many as 20 at a time. And lastly, the event that really shook us, the Walrus, which was engaged largely in marine rescue operations, took off one morning. I saw her go. It hit a cable over Tobruk and crashed in flames. The signal officer I knew well, he was only 23 and a fine chap. And I think that really did upset him. He listed the name of the signal officer, said he wished he'd been able to go to the funeral, but it was over before he knew anything about it. And in fact, there was only, after that, there was only one more paragraph in his journal, despite being many blank pages, and it was not near the end of the war, so I think he was very, very hurt by that event. We'll try and leave on a lighter note. He does mention going on leave to Alexandria and Cairo and Egypt for, I'd say, their leave, but for doing essentially sightseeing or getting a good bed in a hotel, which seemed to be a rare but very important event when they could. And I think the history of these places would have appealed to him very much. And of course, Alexandria goes back to Alexander the Great, and lots of stories there. That's Dad on the left there in Alexandria. And we have a certain number of, I don't know what you call them, family heirlooms, a small carved ivory elephants, and he had a set of wooden camels that he brought back after the war that probably came from Alexandria, and they're very treasured in our family. Picture of the Sphinx and the pyramids, and I showed this to a friend a couple of weeks ago. He said, "You know what's amazing about that picture?" He said, "There's no tourists there." I thought, yeah, I guess. He said it was 80 years ago and in the middle of a war, so he said, "You won't get that picture anymore." I think of all the kind of sightseeing pictures, these are the two of my favorites. I think I call them images from the desert, and they conjure up the vision of the desert that perhaps doesn't exist anymore, but I think they're very interesting, poignant pictures. After the war was over, he was in North Africa till the war ended, of course, in May of 1945. He didn't actually return to England for another 3 months. And then he helped establish, he was from Halifax, United Kingdom. He helped establish the UK branch of the Royal Air Force Association. It still exists today. I found this newspaper clipping from 1946 that Dad had kept. It's in there. And I scanned it and I sent it to the association in England. They were quite tickled that they had this kind of little piece of history. And he was the inaugural secretary when the association started. After the war, in 1947, he emigrated to Canada. He first had to come by himself and establish that he could get a job and feed a family. My older brother and sister were born in England. They then, for different reasons, they sold and went back to England, and sold out and came back again. So he had to go first by himself. But they were coming back, and this is on the Queen Elizabeth. And I said, he followed by my mother and sister and brothers later. This is my mother and Dad crossing the Atlantic. And I put it again because my mother had actually lived in Quebec as a young girl, and she'd been back and forth across the ocean a few times. And of course, Dad had been across the Atlantic many times. But he had never been to Canada before he emigrated. I think England was broke after the war. There were rations till the 1950s. I think he was quite disillusioned about the whole war effort and what was the opportunities for him back in England. And he came here and established a good life in my mind. And of course, that was my parents in 1975, 30 years after the war. And my dad he passed away a couple of years after that. So thank you very much for listening to me and sharing my dad's story. Do you have any
questions? Anybody got any questions, comments?